Okay, now let's talk about what forgiveness is. What forgiveness is. And what I'm trying to do to give you an overview this morning, I'm trying to, in these first three sections, I'm trying to get the big overview done, and then we're going to go back and we're going to see where the biblical evidence for this is. If we did it the other way around, if we just kind of went a passage at a time and tried to build it from the Bible, it'd take 8 hours instead of 4 hours. So this is the way to do it, to get it in 4 hours. So there will be a big section of just Bible later. Okay, what forgiveness is. First of all, most importantly, the most important thing I can tell you all day is so simple. Forgiveness is love. Boy, that's obvious. Well, you know, a lot of people think about forgiveness as an action you do, like going to the DMV and renewing your driver's license. The government told me to do that, so I go do it. God told me to forgive, so I go do it. Okay, I did what I was supposed to do. Now, it's true that God tells us to forgive, but forgiveness is so much more than a task to accomplish. It is more than anything else an expression of love. And as a matter of fact, to give just my own really basic definition of forgiveness, forgiveness is the choice to release justice to the proper authorities and choose to continue to love the person who wronged you. At its very heart, forgiveness is simply a choice to continue loving the person who wronged you. I think that's the best way to define forgiveness. A commitment to keep loving a person who has wronged you. And I think when you remember that that's the very heart of forgiveness, it helps us with some of the hard questions that we're going to come to later on. Okay? So first of all, forgiveness is love. Second of all, forgiveness usually involves some type of release. And if I go too fast at some point and you're trying to write stuff and you're way behind, ask me to stop. I'd be glad to. I told Crystal last night, I've been working on this so fast to try to get it all ready and done, thinking about it all so fast, that I'm really looking forward to just slowing down and talking about it tomorrow. Stopping doing things at double speed. So I don't want to go double speed on you. All right? Forgiveness usually involves some type of release. You could ask the question, what does the word forgiveness mean? Like, what's the definition? And there's just not a simple Bible answer. There are lots of words for forgiveness, and they relate to things like covering, taking away, cleansing, removing, repairing. But probably the one word that summarizes most of it is the word release. So that means releasing someone from repaying a debt to you. And the reason why I say it that way is because that seems to be how Jesus illustrates it in Matthew 18 in his most famous teaching about forgiveness. He illustrated forgiveness with a financial debt. So if somebody owes you money, you can demand that the debt be paid, or you can release the person from the obligation to pay that back. And forgiveness is like releasing a person from paying back a debt that they owe you. So Michael Summers says, in the technical sense, forgiveness is the cancellation of a debt that frees the debtor from all liability to pay. Okay, so releasing someone from repaying a debt to you, or together with that, not or, and releasing judgment to the proper authorities. Okay. So forgiveness involves release. But now we can go a little further. Forgiveness is a commitment to bear the wrong ourselves. See, if Pastor Eric borrows $1,000 from me, then somebody has to pay that $1,000, right? He can pay it back to me, or I can say, don't worry about it. But either way, somebody pays $1,000. You understand? Either he pays it or I pay it. If I forgive him, that doesn't mean nobody pays. That means I pay. If I don't forgive him, I make him pay. Forgiveness is a commitment to pay ourselves to bear the wrong ourselves. Now that's confusing because that's not true in a judicial sense. Okay, that's Jesus paid for the sin in the judicial sense. But in a relational sense, I take the wrong myself instead of making you pay for the wrong. Now, if we were talking about, like, let's say you borrowed my phone because you needed to make a call, and you dropped my phone and you broke the screen. Well, somebody's got to pay here, right? Either you have to pay, or I can say, don't worry about it, and if I say, don't worry about it, I have to pay for my broken screen. If we're talking about a broken phone screen, it's not really that big of a deal, right? If we're talking about $1,000, maybe that's a little bigger of a deal. But what happens when we're talking about really big, serious sins? What happens when we're talking about rape or adultery or abuse or... Now what does it mean to commit to bear the wrong yourself? Now what does it mean to say, I'm not going to pay you back for that? Now it gets really big, right? You see the quotes there in your notes. Do you have quotes there? Yeah. When there is a debt, someone must pay. Either the one who owes must pay it back, or the one who is owed must absorb the loss. The person who forgives no longer expects to be repaid for what he has suffered and lost. And then Timothy Keller writes, no one who is seriously wronged can just forgive the perpetrator. He means without any cost. If you've been robbed of money, opportunity, or happiness, you can either make the wrongdoer pay it back or you can forgive. But when you forgive, that means you absorb the loss and the debt. You bear it yourself. All forgiveness then is costly. Yeah.
In the illustration of a young woman being raped,
Mm-hmm.
she experiences the loss, whether forgiven or not forgiven. She has the loss, but the forgiveness, her forgiving the individual that did that, releases, in a sense, releases that person to the proper authority, but it also releases her into, I don't even know what word to put there, but it releases her into the hands of God to do a healing in her.
Mm-hmm.
Will that ever be undone? That will never be undone.
Yeah.
And can God use that? I hate to use that very loosely. Can God use that for good in her life?
Oh, sure.
To minister to those that have suffered accordingly, but I'm not sure.
That's a very complicated example because, first of all, there's a whole judicial side to it. So there's that whole part of it. Second of all, because it makes for a very complicated relationship between those two people. But when we talk about the commitment to bear the wrong ourselves, and we try to apply it to that kind of a situation, we're talking about the relational part of it. Okay? The person who did wrong, let's say in a rape situation, the person who did wrong to her, if we take God and forgiveness and everything out of the picture, they should spend the rest of their life with her treating them with great hostility.
I'm sorry, I got lost in that. Please do that.
Okay, if I do great wrong to somebody else, I have done great damage to our relationship. And if you take God and forgiveness and everything out of the picture, that relationship is going to be torn apart and characterized by only hostility and vengeance from then on. Okay? So when that person says, I forgive you, what they're saying is, instead of our relationship being torn apart by hostility and vengeance from now on, which is what should happen because of what you've done, not should in the God sense, should in just the human relate. That's the way human relationships work, right? She says, I forgive you. She is saying, instead of you and our relationship being torn apart by this, I'm going to choose to love instead. which means really the weight of all this falls on me. And with God, I bear that. I deal with that. But with you, I move forward with love. I am not going to punish you in our relationship. Now, again, that's complicated because I'll get there in just a second, sorry. That's complicated because we have to remember all our things about what forgiveness doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that person's going to go right back into the same relationship with the person who raped them or anything like that. That's not what I mean. But it is in the relational sense that she says, I forgive you, which means our relationship is not, you are not going to live a life of hostility and vengeance from me. I'm going to bear your wrong myself, and we're going to move forward in love.
And it doesn't mean that person will go to jail.
Exactly. That's why I said the judicial part of it is really separate from that.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Neil Anderson used a little bit different words that say the same thing, and he said forgiveness is the willingness to bear the consequences of another person's action. So it's the same idea,
yeah.
but it's a different,
Right.
a little bit different way to look at it.
Yeah, to bear the relational consequences. I think you can picture it like this. All of this wrong came toward me relationally. You did something very hostile, mean, cruel, unfair to me. And just humanly speaking, I have a choice about whether I'm going to take that and return it to you, or I'm just going to receive that. See? And forgiveness says, I'm going to receive that, and what you're going to get back from me in return is love. Now, you also did wrong to God, and I don't know what God's going to do about you.
That's right.
But what I'm going to do about you is instead of returning the same wrongs that you did to me, I'm going to return to you love. We're going to see that so beautifully in Romans 12 later. All right? That gets us to our next point. Forgiveness is mercifully unfair. Forgiveness always looks wrong in the eye, names it for what it is, feels the sting, then you consciously act unfairly in return. Anger is always about fairness, but forgiveness is mercifully unfair. If you forgive me, you do me an uncanny kindness. So forgiveness is a courageous, clear-minded choice to be mercifully unfair. That's why, for me, the very simple way to define forgiveness is just to picture it, just like I showed you. Okay, your wrong comes to me, and I do two things with that wrong. First of all, I give it to God or other proper authorities. And second of all, I choose that what I'm going to do is return love to you. And that's there's more to forgiveness than that, but that, I think, is the very heart of it. And this is why some people absolutely refuse to forgive. Because they say, an eye for an eye. I'm committed to fairness, justice. You're going to get everything you deserve. They know that forgiveness is unfair, and that's precisely why they will not forgive. Of course, they might see it differently if they were the offender. Right?
I think, too, that absorbing and bearing it yourself comes in the form of grief. But once you can grieve that and release it to the Lord, it's easier to forgive as far as the offense that's been done to you, to identify
Yes.
it.
Yes.
The grief that comes
Yes.
if you're molested by somebody.
Yes.
There's a grief there that you have to absorb and understand.
Yes.
But yet then you can look at that sin and be grieved over it and give it to the Lord, and even look at that sinner and be able to forgive them even with that sin being part of it.
Yes.
And you are
Absolutely.
carrying free, but
And that's part of why it's so important, like we said earlier, that forgiveness does not mean that all the hurts and things are gone. It's really the opposite of that. And it doesn't mean that we minimize it. It's just like the quote we just read there from Powlison. Forgiveness looks wrong in the eye, names it for what it is, feels the sting. So you're right, the grieving process, the hurting, the personal hurt, that's all part of you bearing it. And those things are not wrong, you know? And it's really, people deal with grief and hurt sometimes by attacking. And God wants us to take the grief and the hurt and deal with them with Him. Steve?
Yeah, we didn't use the word, but I'll throw a word out, unilateral. And I think earlier you suggested that forgiveness is a unilateral action, in a sense, in that it doesn't require the cooperation of the other person. Meaning if you choose to forgive someone, you do it because you're choosing to forgive that person. But that makes me question or wonder, these quotes that are on this page here, do they presuppose that the person has first asked for forgiveness before it is given? And if not, is it possible to be as effective in your forgiveness doing so without the other person's knowledge?
Yeah. That's such a huge question and debate, really, that I have actually a separate handout just for that question itself, because it's so important. So we're going to come back to that later in the hard questions, and I think that's very, very important. Yeah. Any other questions at this point? Letty.
I think in this context too, it relates to denying self, because I think in the flesh, we tend to want to find satisfaction in hurting back or retaliating or giving that tit for tat type of attitude.
Yeah.
So the taking on upon yourself, because when I first started to write this, to take the wrong myself, I was thinking, how do you do that? But it is denying yourself from taking retaliation or giving them the same thing or hurting them back.
Yeah.
And so you do, like she mentioned, you take the grief. And has a lot of denying self involved.
Mm-hmm. It has a lot of fellowship with Jesus involved,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
The only way-
bearing
Yeah.
closeness to the suffering Savior is really so important. Yeah. The next point, I think, is something that I think is already becoming clear in what we've said. Forgiveness can relate to something judicial, but usually it's something relational. There's often a judicial part, as we keep coming into. But in general, when we talk about forgiveness, it's good for us to remember that we're primarily talking relational. And I put there one of the technical definitions of forgiveness from a theological lexicon. And the reason I put it there is because even though it's kind of a technical definition, right there in the middle of that definition, you have the word relationship in connection with the relationship. So even they are recognizing that forgiveness is really something relational. And when we use the word forgiveness in a legal setting, that's actually kind of different. Like presidents and governors can issue pardons, but that's related to laws and convictions, and right, that's not even the same thing we're talking about when we're talking about human forgiveness. It's really a different category, and we release those things to God. You know, to use an illustration I'll come back to later because it's such a common one. Suppose a mother-in-law says some really nasty things about how her daughter-in-law is parenting the grandkids. You know, well, wrong has been done, but it's not something legal. And it's not even something measurable. It's relational, you know. Okay, so does that make sense? We really want to keep our focus on the relational part of it. Next, forgiveness releases justice to God and any appropriate earthly authorities. That's why we focus on the relational part of it, because the justice is really most often in the hands of other people. And so sometimes you have to make decisions about what to do there. But forgiveness recognizes. Forgiveness has to recognize. Forgiveness has to have the humility to recognize that I'm not the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, and the prison guard. But sometimes we try to do that to other people. We try to play all those roles and get them back for what they've done. And God calls us to let Him be prosecutor and judge and jury and prison guard. All right, next, forgiveness is an event and a process. All right, so I want to prevent two misunderstandings. One is the one that we mentioned earlier, the idea that forgiveness is a feeling you wait for. you come along and you heal and you grow and you get through it and finally you feel like forgiving. That's not forgiveness. Jesus talked about forgiveness as something that you can choose in a moment. I'm not saying it's always that simple, but forgiveness is something that you choose. If you stand praying and remember that your brother has something against you, forgive, Jesus says. There it is, forgive. So don't think of forgiveness as the end of a long process of your feelings finally feeling like forgiving. But don't think of forgiveness as just an event and it's over. Because if forgiveness is a commitment to love, then what does that mean about the next day? Right? You see Peter Brain there says forgiveness is something that is done in a moment but needs to be reconfirmed consistently. That choice needs to be lived out and reaffirmed each day. I chose to love you. Well, I got to keep living in that choice tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day. So forgiveness is an event, but it is definitely a process. And that, I think, can encourage you when you struggle with, boy, did I really forgive them? Why am I struggling to love them today? Well, of course you're struggling to love them today. They did great wrong to you, and it really hurt, and it still hurts. But that doesn't mean you didn't forgive. It just means that today you have to continue to live out the forgiveness. It doesn't mean that you're a failure and you haven't forgiven them. Forgiveness doesn't make the hurt go away. It doesn't make the struggle go away, though it can really, really make a difference. But does that make sense? Okay? And then forgiveness is not optional. So again, we're talking about relational forgiveness. It's commanded by God in the Bible, and it comes with a huge warning. People who won't forgive won't be forgiven by God. And so if you're a person who says, I demand justice, I demand that everything be fair, I demand that everyone who hurts me gets all that they deserve, then God says, okay, then you will receive justice, you will receive what's fair, and you will get what you deserve for your sin against God. Now, that doesn't mean that forgiveness is simple or that a struggle to forgive means you aren't forgiven by God. Okay, make sure you hear that. That does not mean that a struggle to forgive means you aren't forgiven by God. But each person who wants God's forgiveness must be willing to have a forgiving spirit toward others. We'll look at those passages later. But any questions on that? Okay, then Letty was touching on this. Forgiveness is something that needs to be empowered by God. Jim Newcomer says, the factory default mode of every person is to be unmerciful. And so forgiveness is something that's not really natural for us. Now, it's true that people without a relationship with God can forgive sometimes, but the full riches of love and forgiveness, I think, are really only made possible by God. And He empowers what may well seem impossible to us. And then finally, forgiveness is done by forgiven people. This is the central teaching in the Bible about forgiveness. Forgiveness is like a gift that is passed on by people who have received it. You receive forgiveness from God, and you pass it on. How are we doing? Can we get one more little section, and then we'll take a break for a few minutes? So I want to just speak for a moment about what, I bet we can do 2 sections here. That I think let's try to finish the overview, all right? And then we'll stop and let our brains try to, for a minute.